In Great Britain, most people learn to drive by doing weekly driving lessons with a driving instructor, and some people are fortunate enough to have a friend or family member who can sit with them to help them out. But either way, this process is likely going to take months. So is there a quicker way? Well, yes, actually, they're called intensive driving courses, but they're far from feasible for everybody. So in this video, I'm going to explain their advantages and their disadvantages. Firstly, I need to point out that there's no official definition for what an intensive driving course is. Usually, but not always, they're between 4 and 6 hours a day. They can be more, they can be less, and for a set number of days. How many hours you do per day and for how many days, well, that depends on the course you choose. But there's also something called a residential course. Now, a residential course is an intensive driving course, but the learner is away from home. They're staying at a hotel or a B&B, and that's the residential bit of the residential intensive driving course. Why would somebody do this though? Well, people have their reasons, many different kinds of reasons. Two I can think of is one, they want to be away from home so they can solely focus on learning to drive without the normal distractions of their normal life, or they don't have enough time. They have enough time for a holiday or an intensive driving course. They want to do both. Well, they try to do both, and they book an intensive driving course in a beautiful part of the country, and part of the day is spent learning to drive and part of the day is spent being on holiday. They're not for everybody, but they do exist. I'm going to start on a positive note, the advantages of intensive driving courses. The first advantage, which is probably the most obvious advantage, and actually the reason why many people who choose to do one of these courses choose to do it in the first place, is that you're likely going to pass your driving test in weeks instead of months. That's a big deal. That's a big reason to do it. Another advantage is also you're likely going to need less hours overall because your hours are condensed, there's less breaks and less time for you to forget what you did last lesson. A less obvious advantage though is confidence efficiency. What you need to understand is that when someone's learning to drive, they're at their lowest confidence at the beginning of a driving lesson. And it takes them a few minutes to warm up into it, and not a lot of learning happens during that warm-up phase. If they're doing, let's compare 6 hours in a day to 6 hours doing 1 hour once a week. So here's my fingers and thumbs. Each one of these fingers and thumbs represents a 1 hour lesson. So 6 of them, it's taken 6 weeks. They've done a low confidence start, another one, that's 6 of them. 6 low confidence starts where it's going to be a bit slow and they're not going to learn much in that little bit of the lesson. Whereas if you do 6 hours in one day, you only have 1 low confidence start, your confidence rises and it maintains throughout those 6 hours. Yes, you're going to have breaks, you're not going to do 6 hours all at once, but during those breaks your confidence isn't going to drop much. Nothing like it would drop over the course of a week gap. Another advantage is, well actually this one's just personal preference, some people like to focus on something intensively, get it done and move on, and don't like doing things slowly over the course of many weeks. So they are some of the advantages of doing an intensive driving course, but the trouble with them is they come with many disadvantages. The first disadvantage is cost. Many of these courses run into the thousands of pounds, and for many people that's just not possible, which is one of the reasons why it's not feasible for everybody. But something else you need to be aware of is the hourly rate. Some are reasonable, some are similar to weekly lessons, but some of the courses are sold in a way that disguises the hourly rate. They sell you the learn to drive in this many days for this much money, and you look at it and think, I'm going to learn to drive in not many days at all. Let's call it a week. I'm going to learn to drive in a week and I'm going to pay that. It's going to be great. I'm going to get my license, get my car, No one can guarantee you're going to pass after that many days. No one knows if you're going to pass, and you're not necessarily going to do a test after that many days. What that course is saying is you're going to do driving lessons on each of those days, and that's how much it's going to cost. And what you need to find out is how many hours you're getting on each day and how many hours you are paying for. Because sometimes when you figure that out, you realize this course is being dressed up and sold to trick you into thinking I'm going to learn to drive, which doesn't mean pass your driving test. You're not necessarily going to finish learning to drive. For this much money, I'm going to learn to drive for this much money. That sounds like good value, and you realize you get very little hours at all. Be careful. Another disadvantage is time. Now, one of the main advantages is you pass in weeks instead of months, but during those weeks, you've got to put a lot of time into your driving lessons. And if you can't do that, then an intensive driving course isn't for you. But then you've also got to consider the commitment. Usually you have to pay up front for these courses, which is understandable because a driving instructor needs to set aside quite a large amount of their time for your course. And if you don't show up, well, where are they going to get their money from for that week? So they need some kind of deposit to know that even if you don't show up, they're not going to lose out completely. Otherwise, a driving instructor is not going to set aside that much time, not knowing whether or not they're going to get paid. But this is a problem, you see, because you don't usually book an intensive course for a few days' time or next week. Quite often, it's at least a month in advance. Could be a couple of months. And you don't know what's going to happen when you get there, when you get to your date to do your course. You could be ill. Something could have happened in your life where it makes it hard for you to do this. Are you going to get your money back? Well, that depends on the terms and conditions and how early you let them know. But it is a bit of a risk. Also, you don't know whether or not you're going to get on with your driving instructor. You've booked for an intensive, that word there, intensive course with somebody that you don't know. What happens if you don't get on? What happens if you think they're not helping you, they're actually making you worse? Well, you've paid for it now you've got to put up with it. So it can be a bit risky. Another disadvantage is concentration. If you're doing 6 hours in one day, are you going to be able to concentrate during those 6 hours? Well, actually, in my experience, the majority of people can, but it all comes down to the driving instructor. Okay, there's going to be exceptions where it's just not for everybody, but if the driving instructor gets this one right, most people will not only be able to do 6 hours, they will enjoy 6 hours. If the instructor structures the lesson in a way that's manageable for the pupil, where the pupil can handle what they're doing, they're not stressed, they're improving, learning, they're enjoying, they want to do more because they're getting somewhere, those 6 hours are going to go quickly and they're probably not going to want to stop after 6 hours. But if the driving instructor hasn't structured the lesson well and it's really stressful for the pupil and the pupil's having to think hard and it's just exhausting, well, if it's difficult, well, an hour is going to be difficult, half an hour is going to be difficult, let alone 6 hours. So a lot of that does come down to how the lesson is planned and how skilled the instructor is at helping people learn to drive. That, again, is a risk because you don't necessarily know who's going to be teaching you. You don't know how your lessons are going to be if you haven't had an assessment lesson and you just booked an intensive course. Another disadvantage, which was actually one of the advantages from earlier, is learning quickly in a short period of time means there's less gaps between your lessons and therefore less time for you to forget from last lesson. How could this possibly be a disadvantage, I hear you ask? Surely learning it more quickly is better. But generally, when you learn something in a short period of time, it's more likely going to be in your short-term memory. When you learn something over a long period of time and keep coming back to it again and again and again and again and again, it's more likely going to be forced into your longer term memory, and therefore after you've passed your driving test in years to come, you're more likely going to remember what you were taught. The next disadvantage is only really a disadvantage if there's a driving test at the end of the intensive course, because what that driving test does is it puts the pupil under real pressure to learn quickly. And the trouble with trying to learn quickly is it takes longer. The pupil feels they need to learn quickly, they rush their learning, and they take longer to learn. So in my opinion, it's better to learn to drive first and then book the driving test. Now you may be thinking, well, how long are you going to wait for this driving test? There's a huge waiting list. But that's how I do things with my pupils. They learn first and then they book the driving test. It doesn't take them weeks to find a cancellation. Usually it's just a matter of days. Now I know the waiting list for driving tests in Great Britain has been long for quite a while now, but once my pupil understands that they can find a cancelled driving test, usually within a matter of days, that takes away a big weight off of their shoulders and puts them under less pressure to learn, meaning usually they learn better. Also, once they're ready to pass their driving test and they go searching for the test and they find one, they found it. It didn't take them too long to find it. Now they feel less pressure to pass because they know if they fail, they can go and find another one. Imagine trying to pass your driving test feeling like if you were to fail it, you're going to have to wait 4, 5, 6 months, whatever the current waiting list is in your area, before you're able to do another one. That's a lot of pressure. That pressure alone, I would say, is enough to make some people fail. Another disadvantage is weather conditions and daylight. If you're learning in a short period of time, you're less likely going to experience different weather conditions. But if you're learning over several months and you go through the seasons where you're going to experience different weather conditions during those seasons, and you may even get some experience at driving when it's dark. I don't advise doing an intensive driving course without first doing an assessment lesson. The assessment lesson allows the driving instructor to figure out where you're at and advise an appropriate course to get you to where you want to be. But also make sure your assessment lesson is done by the instructor that will be doing the intensive course with you, because that way you get to check them out and see if you get on. So there are some of the advantages and disadvantages of intensive driving courses. You have to make your own decisions. Some of those advantages are going to be important to some people, but not important to others. And some of the disadvantages are also going to be important to some people, but not for others. You have to balance the advantages and disadvantages and choose what course is better for you. And if you can't afford it, then that option isn't even there. And that's how it was when I was learning to drive. I wanted to learn as quick as I could. I wanted to do an intensive driving course, but simply I couldn't afford one. And knowing what I know now, let's say I couldn't drive and I needed to learn to drive, but I knew how the industry worked and I understood those advantages and disadvantages, I would still want to do the intensive driving course, simply because if I could afford it, I'd want to learn as quickly as I possibly could. Well, I hope you found this video interesting and helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're looking for car insurance, check out the links to Collingwood and Confused in the description. If you're learning to drive and want to insure yourself on somebody else's car, then Collingwood are there for you, because you can do so without affecting the owner's policy. And that takes away a big stress from the owner of that car that you're using to practice your driving in. And via the link at the moment, there's up to 35% off and a £20 Amazon gift card. If you want to insure your own car, I recommend checking out the link to confused.com, because you fill out one quote form and get loads of quotes back from many insurers to compare who's cheapest. And you can change your car on that quote as many times as you like without having to do the whole quote again. So you can just change the car, recalculate, and that's a really quick and easy way to compare how much it costs to insure different cars. Using the links doesn't cost you anything, but it does support the channel, so thank you very much. Subscribe to get my future videos, and until the next one, cheerio.